So back in 1989, Nintendo did something pretty interesting by introducing the Game Boy into the marketplace. Now, whereas video games had mostly been regulated to consoles and at-home experiences, sure, there were some offshoot things that would give you a somewhat video game experience. There was nothing quite like the Game Boy available on the marketplace because you were playing full video games, games that had characters, stories, worlds to explore, and the Game Boy really turned the world of video games upside down. Of course, there's been many iterations of Game Boys throughout the years, but I feel like one that goes criminally underlooked is the Game Boy Pocket. Now, the Game Boy Pocket released in 1996, 7 years after the original release of the Game Boy, but I still think it's a very important system. So today, we're going to take a look at the Game Boy Pocket that I picked up. We're going to unbox it. Hopefully it works, and I'm going to tell you guys why this was such an important system, especially for the evolution of handheld video games. All right, so I'm actually using a different camera than what I normally film with here. I'm trying sort of an easier setup for me, so let me know in the comments how this looks. But here, of course, is the original, the wide boy, the fat boy, the original Game Boy that came out in 1989. Now, unfortunately, mine's not working. I might actually make a video. Let me know in the comments section down below if that's something you would like to watch. But essentially what I believe is going on here is these contacts are just disgusting with corrosion. These are fresh batteries that I literally put in a few minutes ago to sort of give you guys a comparison. But you could see this is a chunky boy. You got this pea green screen on it, and I mean, it worked. Like, it was a great system, don't get me wrong, but the Game Boy Pocket, I feel, really changed things up and brought, you know, a new sense of ideas to the table when it came to things like revisions and important revisions for handheld consoles. So when you look at this, you can see right off the bat, like, the box of this is literally the size of the complete system. We have a different battery infrastructure here with this, and this is a complete in-box Game Boy Pocket. Now, I have not actually played this since buying it. I pretty much just put it on my behind me because I knew I wanted to make a video on it. You can see the back of the box here. New compact size, batteries included. Well, I have my own batteries. Improved screen, library of over 400 games, because of course you could play every original Game Boy game on this system. You can see that looks like a GameStop sticker on here. Wow, I'm sure this thing sold for dirt cheap. And of course we have the different variants when it comes to colors. Now, they did do this on the standard Game Boy with things like the Game Boy Play It Loud series, but I feel like this was just cooler. So let's open this up here. Here is our beautiful, oh, it did come with batteries. I bought this, like I said, off of Whatnot. Use the link in the description box down below so that I can get some more money to buy cool stuff. But I mean, just look at the size difference here. Like, this is literally David and Goliath. And what's interesting about it is the Game Boy Pocket actually has a slightly bigger screen than the original Game Boy. You just have a much more compact design. Of course, when we looked at the back of the system, we could see here, we're just talking 2 AAA batteries as opposed to 4 AA batteries. So hopefully the batteries in here work, because if they don't, then, well, I guess I'm gonna have to use my own batteries. And we have some literature in here. And this is always just a real trip down memory lane, I feel. We have the compact video game system. That's actually very interesting when you think about it. Just, you know, right here on the forefront, it's a compact video game system. We, of course, it's color. You know, this is back in the day when companies cared about things. We have basically how everything works, headphones, the stereo, the Game Link cable was actually a different port as well, making it a bit smaller so that it was easier to access. It's on the different side. You can see here that the port is way smaller, so you couldn't use your original Game Boy port on there, but you know, whatever. How many people really have link cables? My original Game Boy came with the link cable because I got F1 Race on it. And you can see here some different stuff. How to install batteries because you are an idiot and you don't know how to do it. Just a very cool little thing here. And, you know, just a nice little instruction booklet. But it's all about the system. It's all about the screen. It's all about the audio on it. We could see here the translucent case, so we could see the innards of a system. It's actually pretty amazing, you know, looking at just the chips and stuff. All the sort of stuff that they have to do to make something that, we take for granted nowadays, but all the things you have to do to make a system, work. All right, let's pop in a little Wario Land, Super Mario Land 3.
Prepare your pockets for some Game Boy. This is the Game Boy Pocket, released in 1996, several years after the original Game Boy. It's smaller, it's lighter, and it uses 2 AAA batteries to deliver hours of video gaming fun. Here it is next to its older sibling, the original giant hulking Game Boy. As you see, the Game Boy Pocket is like half the size of that thing. And I like the cool transparent case, but is it better than the Tiger Gamecom? Yes, that was a stupid question. It's better because it's a Nintendo Game Boy and plays Game Boy games. There's a lot of them. And it's fun to collect for the Game Boy. But do you need a Game Boy Pocket instead of the original Game Boy? Well, if you love Game Boy and you have pockets, then yes, you need the Game Boy Pocket, which fits in pockets. The original Game Boy, which does not say pocket, does not fit in pockets. And Classic Game Room uses science to prove this. Here's Derek demonstrating that the original Game Boy does not fit into pockets. Also, he exploded into flames 5 minutes later. He'll be missed. Not much, but maybe a little. Before his tragic accident, Derek also demonstrates that the Gamecom does not fit in pockets. So really, if you have pockets, then the Game Boy Pocket is the Game Boy for you and your pockets. Ah, one can dream. One can dream. The best thing about the Game Boy Pocket is that it's a Game Boy, and in addition to fitting in your pocket, it works really well. It's a far more comfortable Game Boy than the original, and the screen is actually pretty good if you have enough light to see it. If you're an old school Game Boy purist and want to enjoy Game Boy games in their original black and white, non-backlit glory, then the Game Boy Pocket is the Game Boy I would recommend. Even if you don't have pockets, it's still the one I would recommend. For black and white, if you want color and a backlit screen, I would recommend the Game Boy Advance SP. But in all fairness, the Game Boy Advance SP does not say pocket, so it may not be safe to fit in your pockets. Just something to consider. Safety. The Game Boy Pocket has been pocket tested. And Pocket performs. It also has a monstrous library of games, most of which are reasonably affordable and fun to play. Everybody watching this show should have at least one Game Boy. There's many models to choose from, and countless games to play on it. I like the Game Boy Pocket. It's the only one pocket rated for pocket performance, but it's also cool. It's black and white, and that's edgy.
Hey guys, what is up? It's Duncan, and today I'm here with a review of the Game Boy Pocket. The Game Boy Pocket was the second in Nintendo's Game Boy line, so I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a full review on it, some history, as well as I'm going to compare it to the Game Boy, as well as the Game Boy Color, to kind of give you guys a sense of how far it came. Anyway guys, let's get this one started. This is the latest technology, covering everything tech. Okay guys, so let's go ahead and just jump right on into this. So, the Game Boy Pocket was it was a pretty cool Game Boy, I gotta admit. So, the first thing you gotta know about the Game Boy Pocket is that it's less of a new Game Boy when it came out, and it's more of like a Game Boy Light or a Game Boy Slim or whatever. So, I actually do have two of these. I'll show you the black one again in a minute, but this was the green one, and I like it a lot. So, as you can see here, it has a nice size screen. It's almost a 2.6 inch screen. Nowadays it's not that huge, but it's pretty big, especially taking into consideration the other two, but of course I'll show you guys all that later. As with all Game Boys, or at least the original ones, has A and B button, start and select, and your D-pad. All of them work fine, no problems. The sound actually was not too amazing on these Game Boy Pockets. It was a little bit quieter, but, that's not a big deal, because it, of course, did have a headphone jack. As well as it also had, you could plug it in and run it off of AC power instead of, your batteries. So we turned over on its side. There's not a whole lot here except your volume, which, of course, there's volume, and then your normal Game Boy link port. So, you could hook up to another Game Boy, exchange high scores, etc. On the front, you just have the power switch, And it's something I thought was kind of interesting to note. When you flip that switch, it used to be on the old Game Boys, a little arm would come over and hold on that little notch, but they kind of took that out for the Game Boy Pocket. I guess they realized that people aren't pulling the games out while they're playing them. Now on this side is the contrast. I will show you guys the contrast in the screen in a minute. Safe to say, the Game Boy Pocket is much, much better to play with than the original Game Boy, just about in all categories. We flip it over on the back. See, this is where your games, no big deal, just, slide your games in. And then this, unlike the original one, it uses 2 AAA. Now, the original Game Boy uses 4 AA, so using just a couple AAA batteries is pretty good. Now, it's kind of hard, of course, battery life is never an exact thing, but generally with the Game Boy Pocket, you could get around 10 hours of battery life, which is pretty good. Okay, guys, so as you can see here, we have all 3 of them. We have the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Pocket, and then the Game Boy Color. So as you can see, the Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Color are very, very similar. I'll show you guys that in just a second. But, I mean, as you can see, the Game Boy Pocket was much smaller than both of these, including the Game Boy Color. If I pick it up for you guys here, you can see that it lacked that big bulge. And, of course, this big bulge is because it uses 2 AA's instead of 2 AAA's. But as you can see, I mean, it's quite a bit smaller just about everywhere. And the interesting thing is, even though it still has that sort of black and white screen as opposed to the nice color screen on the Game Boy Color, this screen right here was almost 2.6 inches, whereas this one was only about 2.3. You can kind of see it like that. But where you really see it is when you're playing it. I mean, guys, it's a big difference, and it's really nice. I mean, if this only had, like the nice color screen of this, I mean, this would be perfect. But unfortunately, it's kind of a black screen, but I'll show you guys that in a minute. So while we're doing size comparisons, I just figure I might as well show you guys something. Here's an iPod Touch. I'm sure you guys know about the size of this. So we pick it up, and you guys can see the screen is much larger. It's actually pretty similar in size. It's quite a bit thicker, but it's actually about the right size footprint, maybe just a little bit bigger. But still, guys, I've got to say, the Game Boy Pocket is not a problem at all to put in your pocket, as the name suggests. It's really comfortable. I mean, even this can kind of be a little bit bulky to put in your pocket, but I mean, like I said, guys, that doesn't look like a huge difference, but it is, and it's pretty good. Okay, guys, so let's just show you a little bit of gameplay on each. So I'm going to go ahead and fire all of them up. Now, they are all playing mostly the exact same game. It's Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow version. So they're all firing up. And you won't be able to see so much from this angle. You will in a minute once they're loaded and everything. But these 3 screens are very, very different. You can see a little bit. This one is very, very green. It's just green and black are the colors. So, it's not very good, guys. I mean, this screen is literally the only reason I wouldn't ever want to play with this. No offense, but yeah. This one is a lot better. It's bigger than both of these screens, and it's black and white. But this one, I like this one the most. Even though it's a little bit smaller, it has color, and it has color because it's a Game Boy Color. It also brings color to some of the older games, such as, the original Game Boy. But it's also a lot clearer. So let's go ahead and pull them all in for you guys and show you what I mean. Okay, guys, so this gives you a really good representation of what the screen looks like. So as you can see, I mean, it's not perfect. Of course, it is black and white. But you can see, take, for example, just look at anything on the screen. As soon as you move, it kind of gets a little blurry. It's not all that bad, really, guys. I mean, I can understand how it could, annoy some people, but to be honest, it's really not bad, especially if you play the original Game Boy.
In 1996, Nintendo released a revised version of the Game Boy called the Game Boy Pocket. This was a console revision, not a brand new console itself. It only plays original Game Boy games. The console was considerably smaller and thinner, hence the Pocket name. This was a big change as it was no longer a giant brick. It also ran on 2 AAA batteries, which was a massive upgrade over the 4 AA's the original Game Boy used. The biggest change came with a new screen. Out were the green and yellow colors. It still has a slight green tint, but it's much closer to black and white. This was a preferred color change for many Game Boy owners. It also minimized the blur that occurred when movement was on the screen, which was also a big upgrade over the original. Although it's also not lit, meaning it still needs optimal external lighting to be played. The Game Boy Pocket played the same games as its predecessor, meaning you didn't need this console to play the newest games. You could still play new releases on the original Game Boy. The Game Boy Pocket added desired revisions to the original Game Boy design. Though it wasn't a huge leap forward, it was absolutely an upgrade from its predecessor.
Game Boy Pocket は小さい、薄い、軽い。画面もくっきり見やすくなって今までのゲームボーイソフトも遊べる。ポケットサイズのゲームボーイポケット新発売。
New Game Boy Pocket. It's smaller. It's thinner. And now, it comes in 6 high-impact colors.
Plays all Game Boy.
So I says to her, I says, hey, is that Bob?
Wow, he looks great.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob, did you cut your hair?
I don't have any hair, Jim. He doesn't have any hair, stupid.
You dork.
You're sure looking thinner there, Bobby baby. Yeah, I dropped a few sizes.
Your screen looks bigger, too.
Not bigger, just a lot sharper. A lot sharper.
Take that new casing, Bob. Silver. So, Bob, do you still play all the games?
All the Game Boy games, babe.
New Game Boy Pocket. Stick in your pocket today.
Whoa, new Game Boy.
Yep, limited edition Game Boy Pocket Gold.
Can I have a go?
Yeah, later.
Hey, aren't you in the 100-meter butterfly?
Yeah.
Your race is on.
What? Nice try, kid.
Limited edition Game Boy Pocket Gold with Donkey Kong Land. $99.95, but only while stocks last.
ねえねえ、私のポケットモンスターと勝負しない？
あんただーれ？
モンスター全部で150種類。通信ケーブルでモンスター取り替えっこ。スーパーゲームボーイならカラーで綺麗。仲間が増えるロールプレイング。ポケットモンスター。赤を買うか緑を買うかちょっと違うよ。
The truly passionate can make their thoughts infectious, inspiring others to love their ideas even if they don't know who came up with them. This is true of Satoshi Tajiri, a private man who is relatively unknown compared to other superstar developers. Despite this, Tajiri's excitement to share his love of games kickstarted a multi-billion-dollar series. This is how a kid wandering the rural countryside of Japan looking for bugs became the creator of the most popular multimedia franchise in history. This is Satoshi Tajiri. Satoshi Tajiri was born in Machida, a suburban part of Tokyo, on August 28, 1965. His father sold Nissan cars, while his mother stayed at home raising Tajiri and his younger sister. Tajiri was a curious child who loved to explore the forests around where he lived. There he found streams and abandoned air raid shelters, where he discovered new insects and animals. Tajiri was an insect fanatic and wanted to be an entomologist. He'd collect bugs so much that his friends called him the Bug Professor. He'd even leave big rocks near trees and come back after some time to see what new bugs had made their home under the stone. From a young age, Tajiri was interested in researching and showing his findings to classmates, so much so that one of his teachers blocked out time for him to present his findings to the class. Tajiri also began making newsletters for his classmates during his later years in elementary school. As time went on, his interest in collecting small creatures evolved past bugs, and he began catching and raising other animals like frogs and crawfish. Unfortunately, Tajiri would find his hobby unsustainable as Tokyo began to modernize. The rivers Tajiri played in when he was younger were filled in as several bridges and dams were built. A great deal of land in Tokyo was also being paved over, further blocking access to the nature he used to explore. Much of the local wildlife was driven away as the city developed, but Tajiri would find a new hobby to fill the void left behind. While he was in middle school, an arcade opened near Tajiri's home, where he was introduced to video games. Like many other Japanese people during this time, Tajiri and his friends took a particular liking to Space Invaders. He found he had a particular knack for playing video games, claiming many of the top scores at the local arcade. Tajiri began to garner a reputation for being able to play games for a long time on very little pocket change, earning him the nickname the Storm of the Arcade. Much of Tajiri's desire to study and share information crossed over into gaming, and he began studying how the games worked. Feeling that others might want to use his knowledge to improve their own scores, Tajiri began writing tips and strategy guides for various titles. He played games so often during this time that one arcade just gave him a Space Invaders cabinet. Tajiri's interest in games grew beyond just playing them and into the early stages of game development. As a young child, he entered a contest held by Universal Entertainment with an idea called the Midnight Crows. Tajiri's vision for the title started with a simple black screen with crows hidden in the darkness. Occasionally, the crows would open their eyes, allowing the players to locate and shoot at them. Tajiri's idea was a hit and was recognized by Universal's contest. In junior high school, he dreamed of creating a sequel to Space Invaders, developing the idea into a concept called Spring Strangers. Tajiri submitted his idea to a contest held by Sega, and ended up winning the grand prize. Sega invited the young Tajiri to their headquarters to accept the award, the first time the burgeoning developer would be welcomed at a game company. This event would have a huge impact on the young Tajiri. However, this passion for video games took its toll on Tajiri's schoolwork, as he often skipped class to go to the arcade and play new games. He almost didn't graduate high school and had no aspirations of attending university, something seen as a requirement in Japanese culture to have a respectable career. Despite giving half the money he'd won from Sega's contest to his parents, they felt that their son was becoming a delinquent because of this hobby. His father knew he was interested in electronics, as Tajiri had saved to buy a PC 8000 so he could learn how to code games. Because of this, Tajiri's father tried to get him a job as an electric utility repair person at the Tokyo Electric Power Company, though Tajiri refused the offer. He did eventually complete a 2-year major in electronics and computer science at the Tokyo National College of Technology. In the early 1980s, Tajiri noticed there was little multimedia about video games despite the popularity of titles like Donkey Kong and Space Invaders, and he decided that he could use his love of collecting and distributing information to his advantage. In 1982, Tajiri published the first issue of a fanzine he called Game Freak, featuring strategy guides on completing games, articles about new arcade releases, lists of Easter eggs to find, and tips on how to get the highest scores possible. Every issue was handwritten and photocopied, then stapled together by Tajiri. The first cover of Game Freak featured Dig Dug, which Tajiri drew himself. However, Tajiri had very little artistic talent, and did his best to draw the pixels on graph paper using the game as reference. Game Freak was first sold at local bookstores for 200 yen per issue, which is roughly $2.35 in today's money. Though this seemed like a somewhat high price for an unofficial, handwritten, photocopied magazine, Tajiri was confident it could be successful.
Did you know? The development studio that created Pokémon, Game Freak, originally began as a self-published gaming fan magazine in 1981. Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of Pokémon, wrote the magazine by hand at the age of 17. Tajiri sold hand-stapled photocopies in small shops for the equivalent of about $3 each. Today, original issues of Game Freak magazine can fetch over $75 a piece. Over time, Tajiri attracted new contributors to his fan magazine, including Ken Sugimori, who would later become the art director for Pokémon. Game Freak was converted into a full-fledged game development studio after the staff grew frustrated with the lack of quality games to write about. They felt they understood what separated a good game from a bad game, and decided to put that feeling to the test. It goes without saying that their efforts paid off. Satoshi Tajiri developed the concept for Pokémon by combining his childhood interests. One of these interests was insect collecting, and he would often compete with his friends to see who could gather the most insects. This went on to influence the collection aspect of the Pokémon series. In an interview with Time magazine, Tajiri stated, "Places to catch insects are rare because of urbanization. Kids play inside their homes now, and a lot had forgotten about catching insects. So had I. When I was making games, something clicked, and I decided to make a game with that concept. Everything I did as a kid is kind of rolled into one. That's what Pokémon is. Playing video games, watching TV, Ultraman with his capsule monsters, they all became ingredients for the game. Ultraman is a major pop icon in Japan from the 1960s. In the television show Ultra 7, when the hero was unable to fight, he would summon monsters from special capsules to fight for him. This idea went on to be the impetus behind Pokémon and the Pokéball item. Pokemon also found inspiration in the Dragon Quest series of games. Dragon Quest V was the first game to popularize catching monsters and using them for battle. Even though this mechanic is similar to the fundamentals of Pokemon, this particular concept isn't the catalyst we're referring to. Before Pokemon even had a name, Tajiri would play Dragon Quest II. One of the equipable hats in the game had a particularly rare chance of appearing after defeating an enemy, and it was very hard to obtain. Tajiri was never lucky enough to find the hat, but his friend and colleague Ken Sugimori was fortunate enough to have 2 of them. Tajiri's desire to own the hat made him consider the possibilities of trading goods between friends on the Game Boy's link cable, and ultimately leading to the idea of trading unique and rare Pokemon. It even impacted the designs of Pokemon, spearheading the design philosophy of, what kind of Pokemon would I want to trade?
One of the reasons that maybe Pikachu is so well liked and loved by many people is that, especially in the first games, it was a really rare Pokemon. It didn't appear very often, and it was really surprising to encounter it. It was a really cute Pokemon that just was extremely rare, so if you saw it, you were really happy to encounter it. And obviously another big reason is that in the animation series, obviously Ash's partner is Pikachu. So people would watch the animation, and it would be a rare Pokemon in the game, so kind of a Pokemon that everyone wants to, have at their side and go on a journey with. At the beginning, when we first released the games, no one knew what Pokemon was, and in Japan, it just kind of grew via word of mouth. The sales they came in slowly at the beginning, and in the US, the animation was shown first, and then the games were released. And after that, kind of the same word of mouth type thing, the popularity grew gradually over time. But every time, obviously, we make a new game, we always have the worry that, maybe this time it won't do as well as before. So yes, obviously in the beginning, a lot of Japanese role-playing games, before the Pokemon games came out, and around that time, weren't very successful overseas. They didn't really find an audience and weren't doing very well. And there was some worry about whether maybe the characters, the Pokemon like Pikachu, were maybe a little bit too cute for the Western audiences, but he thinks one of the reasons for the success of the series is maybe because that they didn't change it. They left it the same as they did in Japan and released it just that way in the Western market. One of the reasons for making it turn-based as it is because they wanted to make it a battle system that people who aren't so great at maybe like action games can play the games, do well in the battles. That gives them time to think and choose their actions. From here on out, there are obviously going to be evolutions to the battle system, but it's probably not going to ever become some kind of really action-packed, fast-paced thing. These virtual worlds where players can meet and they don't have to be in the same place. They can play with each other from faraway locations. While those type of games have interesting elements, the Pokemon series is really all about playing with other people, communicating with other people, kind of in the same space. So a lot of the functions of the black version and white version were added to help out with communication features with people nearby you. For example, one of the things like the rhythm check lets you kind of communicate with other players in the same area. Probably in the future, maybe not a full online thing, but definitely more functionality to help communication with players nearby. So when first making Red and Blue, they really wanted to make a game that was kind of accessible for anyone. Maybe people who are their first time playing a game, or their first time playing the Pokemon series, obviously with the first games. But also at the same time to have a lot of depth to the gameplay, something you can play for a very long time. For newer players, they can pick it up and anyone can play it. But once they start playing it for a long time and discover some of the depth there, they can find a whole new level of fun there. And the more hardcore players, the more core players who know a lot about the depth of the battle system can kind of communicate with the newer players, teach them the various aspects of the battle system, and that there's a lot of communication that's born from there. To answer the first question, yes, he does know about the way to get Mew. Actually, an interesting story is that his email address back then, his cell phone email address back then, was really easy to kind of understand, and he got an email from like a middle school student saying that I know how to get Mew in the game, and he was like, oh wow. Other than that, obviously he enjoys, those kind of weird, quirky parts of games. Like, for example, in Mario, you can get the infinite one-ups, certain tricks like that. And that's, one way to enjoy games. So he encourages people to try and find interesting, quirky things about games.
Today marks the 30th anniversary of one of the world's biggest pop culture phenomenons, still going strong to this day. Pokémon made its debut as a video game in Japan in 1996. A few years later, it would explode into a media juggernaut with video games, TV series, movies, trading cards, and more. It follows trainers collecting different Pokémon and using them in battles against others. The trading cards are also valuable, sometimes going for thousands of dollars each. That's led to thieves targeting them in card shop break-ins.
The success of Pokémon was a fluke, at least the monumental success that we've come to know, and I mean even Nintendo didn't think it would last. The developers of the first few games assumed Pokémon was just a fad and would die off by the turn of the millennium. Originally started from lead creator Satoshi Tajiri's love of bug collecting, this collectathon RPG showed promise to the higher-ups at Nintendo, such as Shigeru Miyamoto, but even the Western localization team didn't imagine that American audiences would care for the cute creatures, and pushed for more aggressively designed monsters. But of course, Game Freak and the producers at Nintendo stood their ground, and we wound up with the notable and memorable creatures that we've all come to know. The development team even had to halt work on Pokémon to raise funds with other projects. All of their work paid off when in 1996, Pokémon Red and Green were released to Japanese audiences, before getting a slight tune-up and eventually releasing as Red and Blue internationally. These first games in what would become a monstrous franchise sold more than a whopping 31 million units on the Game Boy, not even counting the additional 14.6 million copies of the special Yellow Edition that followed soon after. The development of the Pokémon franchise was truly one of those a little boy with a dream sort of stories, and through the pursuit of that dream, the legacy of the Pokémon series will exist for as long as video games continue to be played. So let's figure out how this little third-party title ended up solidifying one of the best-selling and most easily recognizable video game franchises of all time by looking into what's so great about Pokémon's first generation. The first Pokémon games made the concept of RPGs digestible to a wider audience, and ultimately a more casual audience at that. I didn't even realize until much later in my life that Pokémon was an RPG of any kind, because of how well they spoon-feed the concept to you. Powers and attacks of individual Pokémon are also easily understood and assumed. After all, it may be difficult to determine the differences in abilities between traditional fantasy RPG classes, like what can a wizard do differently than a druid, or a cleric, or a sorcerer, and how would those classes balance with completely different categories of rangers, warriors, or rogues. But just from a surface level understanding, it's much easier to tell the difference between fire, water, grass, and electricity. The use of a rock, paper, scissors approach to combat also made it easily digestible. But it's as though the developers extended rock, paper, and scissors to 15 total options at the start of the franchise. And while it may take some time to remember them all, many of the interactions are very understandable, like fire melts ice, the ground doesn't conduct electricity, and birds eat bugs. And instead of mana being used across all special moves, each move has its own source of energy in the form of power points, or PP. That way, less strategy-driven players are able to keep track of how much more they'll be able to use their favorite moves without worrying about running out of other options. Without explicitly saying it, the choices of your starter Pokemon represent 3 different difficulty modes: easy, medium, and hard. Easy mode would be if the player chooses Bulbasaur, the first Pokemon in the Pokédex. It evolves to its final form the earliest, has access to tons of status-changing effects like Sleep Powder and Stun Spore, and its Grass-type attacks and status give you a hefty advantage of the first 3 gyms. Even after that, the 4th and 5th gyms use the same types as Bulbasaur's family line, so you have ample time to stock up your roster for later conflicts. The medium difficulty would be Squirtle, who has the fewest weaknesses out of the starters, has some great base defense, but also has to face a gym full of their electricity weakness in order to attain the 3rd badge, let alone even the 2nd gym being the same type as Squirtle, so there's no explicit advantage to be had beyond the 1st badge. Then finally we have the quote-unquote hard difficulty with Charmander, who has to face one of their weaknesses right off the bat in order to gain your 1st badge. That means you either have to have some decent strategy under your belt if you're going in solo, or you should at least understand how to catch some different Pokemon early on that may give you a type advantage to compensate for Charmander's early weaknesses. Any amateur player could wind up stuck in Pewter City for quite some time if they haven't wrapped their heads around type advantages or learned how to capitalize on status effects and timing during battles.
In January of 2026, the Pokemon Company president and CEO, Surikazu Ishihara, accepted the Andrew Yoon Legend Award for Industry Impact at the New York Game Awards on behalf of the Pokemon Company. During his acceptance speech, Ishihara reflected on his history with the Pokemon Company, as well as how the series has grown over the years. In particular, he highlighted how difficult it was to make the original titles, Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green. He said, "Pokemon originated from a small idea from the Game Freak development team. Wouldn't it be fun if you could catch creatures in a game and trade them with your friends?" Everything started from that simple concept. Continuing, he said, "The development process, however, was not quite as easy. It took a great deal of trial and error to figure out how to actualize that idea with the limited resources we had available. In the end, it took 6 years to complete the first games, Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green. Still, we all felt confident in the main gameplay elements that would become the foundation of the Pokemon game series: catch, raise, trade, and battle." Many fans have reacted with confusion to this speech, with some asking how such primitive games such as Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green could possibly take 6 whole years to make, especially when modern titles like Scarlet and Violet seem to be released on a regular schedule, with a new generation arriving basically every 3 years. Plus, that's not even considering DLC. To put it in perspective, GTA 5 took 5 years to make, a huge, sprawling, ambitious game filled with content, places to visit, and things to do took a year less to make than Pokemon Red and Green. How does that happen? So, welcome to Culture Decks. My name is Nathan Ellensworth, and in this video, to clear up some confusion, we're going to explain exactly how Pokemon Red and Green took 6 years to make. Everything began in 1990, when Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori first pitched the game. The pair had met because Tajiri was creating and self-publishing a gaming magazine called Game Freak. Sugimori reached out to contribute upon seeing Game Freak on store shelves, and thinking he could help improve on the admittedly crude artwork. The pair worked together on the magazine before eventually forming Game Freak as a game development studio, thanks to Satoshi Tajiri's obsession with video games. Satoshi Tajiri was so obsessed with video games and how to make them better that he learned how to program and started developing games for the NES. The first title released by Game Freak was Mendel Palace, or otherwise known as Quinty in Japan. Mendel Palace was a moderate success, selling nearly 70,000 copies in Japan and around 60,000 copies in the US. This, as well as some favourable reviews, got Game Freak some attention, and soon after, they decided to pitch a game called Capsule Monsters to Nintendo, who rejected it. So yes, originally Pokemon was called Capsule Monsters, based upon the idea of collecting monsters and the capsules from gacha machines. Tajiri had grown up in rural Tokyo, spending a lot of time collecting bugs, and he wanted to recreate this experience in a video game, with many original Pokemon taking cues from animals and bugs, as well as kaiju and other monsters from Godzilla and other Toho media. However, Nintendo worried that they would run into copyright issues, especially with one of Pokemon's main inspirations. The 1960s Ultraman TV show saw the hero using small monsters in capsules to fight some bad guys. These were called capsule monsters. So, to avoid any legal difficulties, the game was renamed Pocket Monsters. Eventually, Tajiri met a rather famous game developer called Shigeru Miyamoto, thanks to their mutual friend Tsunekazu Ishihara. Miyamoto had played Mendel Palace, or Quinty, and had rather enjoyed it, so he decided to help Tajiri and Game Freak bring Pokemon to the Game Boy. So, in 1990, Pocket Monsters was once again pitched to Nintendo with the help of Shigeru Miyamoto, and this time accepted, with a preliminary release date of December 1991. Now, you may realise Pokemon did not, in fact, come out in 1991. It turns out there were plenty of issues for the Game Freak team, which mostly boiled down to technical difficulties, lack of funds, staff leaving Game Freak, and the steady creep of developing the many systems involved in the Pokemon games. From 1990 to 1991, development of Pokemon continued fairly steadily, but the team at Game Freak eventually realised they didn't have the money to finish the game, given how large in scope it had become. To earn some extra income, the team made the puzzle game Yoshi for the Game Boy and the NES. Yoshi was a genuine success, selling over 500,000 copies in Japan on its first day alone. This success, as well as its eventual release in the US, funded Game Freak for the foreseeable future. But as the development of Pokemon continued to stretch over the following years, Game Freak had to make several other games to help keep the lights on. Games such as Mario and Wario and Pulseman all came out well before Pokemon eventually made it to market in 1996. At certain points, Satoshi Tajiri would spend long stretches without any pay, relying on his father to help him out, and also spending hours and hours, if not days, in the office, regularly without going home. So yes, Pokemon took so long to make that it was hard to fund it, and the Game Freak team had to juggle multiple projects, all while still trying to keep the dream of Pokemon alive.
Pokemon Red, Green, and Blue are the original Pokemon games. To many, they're looked at as the best in the series, but to others, they're just relics of the past. So recently, I replayed them to figure out if they're really that good. Before we got Pokemon Red and Blue in the East, there was Pokemon Red and Green available in Japan. I don't know what we did wrong to not get the green version over here, but I guess this is fine too. Development began all the way back in 1990, shortly after Game Freak shifted from being a magazine publisher to a game studio. I can only imagine what would have happened if they kept making magazines instead.
Spare change.
Outside of being used to start small fires, the magazine industry has not held up well since the 90s, so this change was probably for the best. But with Pokemon Red and Green not releasing until 1996, that meant that these games had a staggering 6 years of development time. Can you tell? And during this time, a lot of staff like Junichi Masuda had to work multiple jobs just to keep production afloat, while others had to just not get paid at all. But I guess they knew they had something special on their hands because they just persevered on. From its inception, Pokemon was set to do something unique, being the first single-player game to focus on a shared player experience. The whole point of the game was to collect, battle, and trade Pokemon with people you knew in real life. Something that was only a fever dream a few years prior. Now, prior to release, the game guru himself, Shigeru Miyamoto, suggested releasing 2 separate versions as a joke, because he thought that was the only way it could ever outsell Mario. And they took this idea a little too seriously going forward. But finally, after a painstaking 6 years of development, Pokemon Red and Green finally released in Japan. And they did not sell very well.
I guess I'll just die.
By the time this released in 1996, most people were over the Game Boy. The console was pushing 10 years old by this point, and the Game Boy Color and Light were still a few years away. So to get a new RPG for it was not piquing a ton of people's interest at first, but the game was still being sold, and it never stopped. At the time of release, this was the only Pokemon IP on the market. The anime, manga, and trading card game would still not release for a while after. So the only way people heard about this was by talking to their friends and classmates. And what began as a small group of people playing at first quickly spread to every school in Japan. People couldn't get enough, but Pokemon Red and Green had some problems. The original sprites for a lot of Pokemon were somewhere between rough looking and completely horrifying. There were a ton of bugs that could break the game and drive you into psychosis, And compared to a lot of other games that were releasing before this on the Game Boy, this looked a bit dated. So naturally, they did something that would definitely not become a trend going forward and released an enhanced version with Pokémon Blue.
Why get it right the first time when you can just sell it again?
They were already selling the same game twice, so why not add one more to bring in even more cash? Now, Pokémon Blue did fix a good amount of issues. The Pokémon sprites were redone to look better and give you less nightmares, some dialogue was fixed to make things more clear, and they fixed a good amount of the bugs the originals had. Not all of them, just some. So when the game inevitably got set to release around the world, they used this version as the template to make the jump overseas. But unlike last time where they just released the game and let people figure it out for themselves, now they had a plan, a simultaneous multimedia launch. When the Pokemon anime released in Japan, they saw a large uptick in sales the games were getting. So naturally, they wanted to make this a major point of focus for the global release, where the anime would come out a few weeks before the game's initial release to really build up that hype even more. And by the time the game released, people were already familiar with how the gameplay would work. It introduced them to catching Pokemon, battling to level up and evolve, and fighting gyms to get all 8 gym badges. And though it released in late 1998, by the time 1999 rolled around, Pokemon had already taken over the world. You couldn't walk outside without seeing a kid screaming at their Game Boy, something that I still do in public. From the moment you turned the game on, it was deceptively simple, just showing the logo with red standing by a bunch of different Pokemon. When the game starts, you get to pick your name and your rival's name, something that I'm sure a lot of people are not going to take advantage of. And after a brief monologue from Professor Oak, you just begin your journey. You take your first steps out of your house and into Pallet Town. But when you try and leave, you're immediately stopped and yelled at by Professor Oak for trying to touch grass, so he takes you to his lab.
And we just trust this old man to actually take us to his lab? This game really was made in the 90s.
Once you're done getting abducted, you have to make one of the most difficult choices that any child has ever made, being what starter to pick. Charmander, Squirtle, and Bulbasaur were not only a perfectly balanced trio, being fire, water, and grass types, but they also served as a pseudo-difficulty selection. With Charmander being a fire type, he was going to have a hard time with the first 2 gyms, but was great for the later part of the game. Squirtle does really well in the beginning and the end of the game, and Bulbasaur makes the early game a breeze, but the late game a bit of a challenge. But for most people, it came down to which one you liked the best, because you can build your team around any weaknesses later on. Once you pick your starter, your rival Blue picks his, which is nice because you get more choices, but it's also annoying because he picks whatever Pokemon counters you so he can kick rocks. This was a great way to teach players about type matchups as soon as possible. It didn't really matter at first because both of your Pokemon are so low level they don't know any good moves, but the further you get in the game, the more problematic this can become. Your rival will always have at least one Pokemon that hard countered you, unless you're a psychopath and didn't use your starter.
I don't need this Charmander anymore. That's it, boys! We got him!
I can only imagine the kids that did this are in prison now, so we can all live in a safe society.